All right. Allow me to welcome you all to this 25th Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. This is the first meeting of the third year of this series, already running a lot longer than expected, but I'm very happy about this, and I'm extremely happy that I was able to get Gustavo and Luis to present today, because the two of them have a history of publishing on the topic of measuring corruption. Gustavo is a little newer to the field compared to Liz, especially, but he has been very prominent in terms of publishing also over the last few years, and their publications are quite amazing. So I'm very excited to hear about the details of their work today. And I would like to extend my gratitude to all of you that are finding the time to join us today. Just a couple of things about how the roundtable is going to be conducted.
Haben Sie noch andere Schuhe als Lackschuhe?
So the first thing that I was going to mention is please remain with the microphone muted unless you desire to ask a question or make a comment, in which case you can just raise your hand via the emoticon or just visually, and I will invite you to unmute yourself and ask a question. In the announcement, it was stated that the presentation was going to last about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A and open floor discussion. In reality, what we do is we combine the two. So if you have a pressing question or comment about the slide that is presented in front of you at the moment, please don't hesitate. In my experience, it makes for a much more interesting conversation. And I will be doing a lot of the interruption myself. Gustavo, Luis, I apologize for that. But I tend to follow with a lot of curiosity these presentations, and I already have a couple of questions in my pocket for you. So when the moment feels right, I will just unmute myself and interrupt you to engage in a bit of a conversation. Other than that, you will not really hear from me. Luis and Gustavo are the stars of today's meeting, after all. And with that, I would like to invite them to, well, introduce themselves, and you guys can start already sharing your slides, and we can begin with the discussion of this topic.
First, I think I'm going to share the slides. Just a second.
And meanwhile, I'll just want to thank for the invitation to congratulate on the initiative. We were just talking about the frequency of this event and the people you already managed to mobilize to make a presentation on their research. So I'm happy to see also that you have regulars in this group. So thank you also to our audience, to everyone for being with us. Gustavo and I are just going to show you some of the ongoing research. Looking two strands of research. We look at perceptions, attitudes, and self-reported conduct, but we also look at institutional responses. So we're going to have a bit of both today. Gustavo, if you want to introduce yourself. By the way, I'm Luís de Sousa, and I'm a researcher at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon in Portugal.
Hi to all. My name is Gustavo Gouvêa Maciel. I am a PhD candidate at the ICS, the same institution that Luís is part, in Portugal. And I'm basically working on a thesis that deals with tolerance towards corruption in democracy. So to better understand and map what happens when people and citizens overall decide to tolerate or not specific behaviors related to corruption. And basically that is. Thank you all for being here, and I'm looking forward to start this discussion because it's a very interesting topic to be debating. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is the title of our presentation. In fact, we're not just focusing on measuring corruption through perceptions. We'll be also looking at other types of measurements or assessments of the strength or robustness of institutional responses, in this particular case, self-regulation. So we will just briefly introduce you the two research projects that are the basis of this presentation, with two different measurement approaches on the issue of corruption, and then we will divide the presentation between both of us. Gustavo will start talking about the measurement of corruption perception through surveys. I'll look at party ethics, self-regulation later on. So Gustavo, if you, thank you. These are the two projects that we just concluded. One funded by the Portuguese grant award body, the EPICA project. It included a work package on perception measurements of corruption. We had several work packages there. There's a whole roadmap. We've published an article about how we constructed our focus groups to inform the survey. We also had other stages there, the benchmarking of existing surveys on corruption and ethics, which is what Gustavo will be addressing today, was also part of this roadmap. And then the ethics project, which ran in parallel, and it was funded by a private foundation. It was focused on ethics and integrity in political life. We managed to conduct a survey to national MPs and local elected officials. And this was an online survey, and it ran in parallel with the citizen survey under the scope of EPICA. So we managed to repeat some of the questions, and also an experiment that we embedded in the survey, in both the citizen survey and the elite survey, that are the results of that exercise have already been reported and published in Party Politics very recently. So it's out there, it's available for you to look at. Part of, or the main part of this project is a mapping of party ethics, self-regulation. In fact, we were looking at self-regulation at the three core institutions of democratic regimes: political parties, parliaments, and cabinets, governments. So I'm just focusing on self-regulation to promote integrity within party organizations today. So Gustavo, if you want to carry on with the first presentation.
Yes, so from now on, I'm going to talk about the point 2 that we presented in the table of contents. Basically to say that this is part, as Luis mentioned, of the larger project called EPICA. And this project is very interesting because it dealt with different approaches to better understand corruption before effectively conducting a survey, a national survey. And one of these steps, as Luis mentioned, was related to kind of executing or pursuing to present a map of conceptualizations and evaluations of corruption that we already have available, but we don't know much about how those things relate, or how those things somehow, what they tell us about corruption itself. So, sorry, because my computer is not working. Okay, so we had our reasons for, of course, conducting this exercise, and basically most of them are quite expected. They are not new stuff. We do agree that those reasons are basically general, but they say a lot about what in which point we are at by now in terms of measuring corruption through perceptions, because there are still many things to discover or still to clarify and to analyze. And I think this is the point of departure, because there is no much debate on how questions that has been developed to capture perceptions of corruption, they have been made and developed. Basically, to know that corruption surveys, they have proliferated in recent times, but we don't have maps or we don't have trends. We don't know much about what those questions and surveys they offer in terms of providing us effective information about corruption. Because basically we had similar items and questions being developed throughout the years in a non-systematized way. So this exercise comes to kind of systematize this information in terms of giving us information and trying to decode what we have in terms of knowledge on surveying about corruption through perceptions. And of course, we need to bring more clarity to the field, and also to select innovative approaches and to find suitable items and questions that can be used for specific reasons or to better develop future surveys. And finally, to provide a guide for researchers, of course, to avoid some of the most conventional traps when we choose specific questions and items related to corruption to be part of a survey that we are going to that we intend to apply. So in terms of methodological
Gustavo,
aspects,
may I interrupt? I have a question about your previous. Yes, this is like about the reasons, and if this is something that you guys address later, just let me know. But I was wondering if when considering the driving motivation for this work, in terms of what is corruption perceptions, right? Because from a common perspective, perceptions of corruption are indirect measures to assess the frequency or the size of corruption in any given context, right? But from a different perspective, perceptions themselves are the phenomenon that people may be interested in assessing, right? Because perceptions, kind of like opinions or attitudes, they also have significant consequences for political stability and social interactions and economic activities, etc., etc. So are the differentiation between these two motivations of addressing corruption perceptions as a proxy for real corruption or as a phenomenon in itself connected to subjective individual opinions? Is this something that affected some decisions in terms of the design of the study, or if you could say something about this?
We during the peer review process, we had a couple of questions related, I think, to what Joseph mentioned. These kind of divide in terms of measuring corruption through perceptions and using more objective approaches. And Luis, of course, can add something about it, but in my perspective, and from what I remember from that period of the peer review, basically we tried to make sense of the use of perceptions of corruption as a way, of course, to not to contest or to these perceptions are not against they are not an opposite view of objectively measuring corruption. Basically, I think they can add somehow. They both can be together, of course, they can merge. Those are different strategies of measuring corruption, but of course, they are not rival in the sense that they can contribute to the knowledge that we have about measuring corruption in different ways, in complementary ways.
Can I just add that the objective of EPOCA project was to look at how people perceive and react to corruption in contexts of crisis. And so that the focus was from the beginning, although we were considering and discussing objective measurements, etc., but was to see what was out there in terms of perception-based measurements of or perception-based conceptions and measurements, or perception-based definitions and measurements, to put it this way. And so that was the key objective of our research, to look at how people react to corruption in context of crisis. We had a crisis during the financial crisis, corruption was a key issue of street mobilization, protest, and so on, and therefore we even have a popular expression that in when it goes like this, I'm trying to translate from Portuguese, but it's something like when the cows are thin, people complain about the shortage of milk. You know, it's in the sense that in times of crisis, basically the expression, what it means in times of crisis, people become more sensitive towards corruption because of the damaging effects on public finances and redistribution and so on. And also not just on that, but also this sense of relative deprivation, that you somehow, to achieve your objectives, you've been cut short, and you have to find alternative ways of getting what you think it's your right deserve, and so that, you know, adds to the complexity of how people judge, how people perceive the effects of corruption in their personal and professional lives. So from the very beginning, we were interested in perception-based definitions and measurements. On the definition side, because we wanted to look at this tension between deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics. And at the measurement side, we were interested in untangling this relation that we could see in some studies between sociotropic measurements of corruption and egocentric survey items. So that was the point of departure.
Okay, thank you. No, that certainly clarifies it. Sorry, Gustavo, go ahead.
Yeah, but also following what Luis said, these work that kind of map the questions on corruption, it was not the beginning of the process, meaning that we previously conducted a scoping review that dealt with this issue of how to conceptualize and how to measure corruption. And the dimensions that we use it in this work, they came from the results of this scoping review dealing with perceptions of corruption. So from the very beginning, we focused only on perceptions because we had this systematic review that was kind of showing us that we needed to explore to more in terms of what are the questions that we use in what is conceptualized in terms of corruption in these questions. Yeah. That's it.
So we wanted to conduct this survey in 2 dimensions. There are going to be a series of items on the economic dimension, the sense of crisis, and there are going to be another set of questions looking at the various dimensions of corruption, as we mentioned, definitions and looking at sociotropic and egocentric perceptions. And the roadmap, as Gustavo was saying, started with the scoping review. The scoping review was on the literature that was looking at perception-based definitions and measurements. From that, we did after that. Was that the focus group first, Gustavo, or the benchmarking? I think both run in parallel. Okay, so there was the benchmarking of the survey items, which is what Gustavo is presenting today, and focus group with students that had the topic of corruption and public ethics in their syllabi. And we run several of these issues that came out from the scoping review on, sociotropic perceptions, egocentric, how it affects your personal and professional life, and the ontological dimension, the outcome-oriented definitions. And we were, having a discussion, a very fertile discussion with them, so that we could capture dimensions that we could not foresee in these from this benchmarking of existing survey items. We also had a previous survey in 2006. We conducted a survey which also helped to inform this process. So we're not reinventing the wheel. Of course, we also looked at what had already been done at the national level in the context of Portugal. And we were certain that certain items there were already tested. They offered a good ground to be repeated, so that we could also have this comparison in time, because the other one was conducted in 2006, before the financial crisis, before the COVID-19 crisis. And this one was being conducted during the COVID-19 crisis, and also during a very specific event in the Portuguese context, which was the first time we had a prime minister indicted for corruption. So it was a very special moment, that decision to take the prime minister to trial or not. It's a procedure that we have in the Portuguese judicial system called instruction of the case, that we managed to have people interviewed before and after. So it was kind of a natural experiment in this database, okay? And there were some final stages. Obviously, was the discussion of the survey items between a panel of experts, and finally the tests that the company that was conducting. This was a face-to-face survey to a representative sample of the Portuguese population. So they did a couple of pre-tests, I think 3 on total. So we were also able to fine-tune the survey. I mean, it's a very expensive instrument, so we need to be sure that everything is in tune before we go to the field.
That's very instructive, because indeed I was wondering about the methodological impact in terms of the survey construction, of focusing on corruption perception for their own sake, meaning as a phenomenon, compared to wanting to measure corruption through perceptions, which is analytically different. Because measuring corruption through perceptions, if we're focusing on that, then the possibility of doing this during or in the aftermath of a crisis would potentially be considered to be an issue that would bias the results. If what we're trying to do is just assess the extent of corruption via this proxy measure. But if the objective is indeed to assess the individual's perception of corruption, yes, then it becomes not a flaw of the design, but rather the focus, or the most interesting part of it. Yes.
Yeah, it's perfect, because you get more variation. You have a very complex attitudes towards certain scenarios. I mean, there was a scenario on nepotism that you could see the the contamination effect of the context in that scenario, because we had the incumbent party, took a very sort of nepotist style of a cabinet formation. So the people that were invited to the cabinet were very close to the prime minister, and either friends or not family members, but very close friends. In fact, the government just fell down. I don't know if people know about anything about Portuguese politics, but the government just collapsed because the chief of staff of the prime minister was caught having 25,000 euros in his office, and he resigned. And the prime minister resigned because he was betrayed by someone of his own personal choice and personal trust. So this scenario of nepotism was very was strongly contaminated by the context. So yes, as you put it, I think it was the perfect moment to conduct this type of survey.
Definitely. I apologize for the long segue, but please, Gustavo.
So in terms of methods, we must say at first that it was not our goal to perform a meta-analysis. So basically, we don't have in mind a kind of assessment of better or worse, trying to compare the surveys or the quality of the questions, because we took for granted that those surveys and those questions, what mattered was not the quality. Of course, quality is important, but it's kind of the next step in terms of research. First, we had to know what we have in terms of options and what questions express or they tell us about perceptions of corruption. And so just to say that we didn't conduct meta-analysis in this case. And as we know, there is no main online central database or search engine to find this kind of information related to corruption. So we had to frame a strategy to search for corruption surveys through internet. So we established a code book and shared this code book among all people involved, all coders, trying to make sure that everything was following the same rules and the same strategies. And in terms of material for analysis, we opted for exploring not only national or cross-national surveys, but also those that dealt with lower levels of government. Like, for example, subnational surveys that somehow dealt with the issue of corruption in specific regions or at a specific country. And we included surveys targeting not only citizens, but also businessmen or relevant stakeholders, specialists in anti-corruption issues. And the questionnaires, we had this kind of limitation because we only cataloged English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian surveys. Basically, those were the language that we had the opportunity because we know this language. And of course, this is a limitation in terms of the validity, the external validity of the results, but we do encourage people to expand this strategy to other languages. And also data was collected at any point in time meaning that we made no restrictions or developed a specific time frame to catalog the surveys. No, everything that we found was included, irrespective of the period that this data was conducted or collected. And of course, we had to find and to focus on free, public, accessible surveys to explore, because not all information related to the surveys were free, and this was something particularly difficult to deal with during the process, because we had difficulty sometimes to have access to the full questionnaire with the questions available. And also we had, for example, surveys that presented different sets of questions depending on the country that questions were collected. So that we had this kind of things that basically we discussed it through the group, and also we only advanced when everybody agreed. That's to say that we only included things that all the coders, all people involved agreed to be part of the data set in terms of questions and surveys. And all questions in the surveys that did not focus on corruption as the main topic, those questions were removed. We focused only on questions related not only to corruption, but also correlated aspects like ethics, morality, integrity, transparency, legality, crime, and so on, because it was a bit difficult sometimes to separate those dimensions, and it was a huge effort to somehow map and to evaluate when a question is related to corruption or not. But as I mentioned, we only considered questions that all the coders, all people involved agreed in terms of what is or what's not to be part of the data set. And in terms of survey inclusion, we started from the most prestigious worldwide projects that have historically measured corruption, the Global Corruption Barometer, and the World Values Survey, the control of corruption measurement. Those aspects, those measurements, they were not direct part of the data set, because they don't measure corruption per se. They only started the process of discovering or revealing or finding sources where we can find questionnaires and projects that measured corruption through perceptions. And also we considered the repositories, the most prestigious repositories, like, for example, the European repositories, the most GC's repositories, for example, and others, the CESDA catalog that also has information on corruption. And those were the points of start that started the discussion and the data collection. And
Gustavo, about these points, about the inclusion of victimization surveys, could you clarify something about it? I assume that you mean that you ended up utilizing the perception-based questions found within victimization surveys, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I can show you the next slide, because here we have the information regarding each material that we starting point for searching and finding information on questions of corruption. And as you can see, the victimization surveys, we basically used the international crime victim surveys that were applied throughout the world, because the ICVS has a platform online that we can find those questionnaires, and they were publicly available, and they were actually very similar in terms of format, but they were available, and they were considered as the starting point to find new initiatives that dealt with victimization service, because they kind of mention or cite these, and we started like a snowball of information that conducted us to find new sources in different countries that use the same methodologies, but not directly related, for example, to the victimization surveys that were applied to by the International Crime Victims Survey. So it's contamination process that we find new ways to measure based on these initial and most knowledgeable initiatives that measured corruption. I think Luis has something.
Yes, just very quickly to emphasize that the importance of these questionnaires to be published, to be online. And that's also, I mean, a warning, a reminder to all of us that conduct surveys and have projects financed by grant award bodies or private foundations, whatever, that we should try to put our data and questionnaires available to others. And that's obviously a constraint when we're doing this kind of coding. Language is also a constraint, although we managed to code Portuguese, English, French, Italian, and some German, although we were kind of limited on the German side, but obviously there might be many others published in Arabic or Chinese or whatever, but we can't manage to interpret and to code that information. So that's definitely a limitation that I would like to signal.
So for you to know that, for example, 11 rounds of the Global Corruption Barometer, and also the ISSP rounds, and WVS rounds, Latino Barometer, all rounds, Eurobarometer, Asian Barometer survey, Arab Barometer, the new Russian barometers, the ICVS, as I mentioned, they were all part of this process, but not only them. Other 211 survey rounds from other institutions around the world, ranging from 1976 to 2019, they were collected and included in this data set. We have the entire list of the survey rounds and the survey institutions that we kind of collected information from. It's available online. This presentation has the link here. This slide has the link, and you can request access. Send a message will be sent to Luis, I think, and to agree on the download of this source. But it's
that is great to hear. So the data sets that this project constructed as part of the research project, so that's publicly available. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah,
Yes.
it's publicly available.
Fantastic.
And as Gustavo said, there's only a tiny control, which is when you accede to this platform, API's platform, to download the data. The authors are sent an email to grant permission. the reason why we put this was not to limit access, was to know who is interested, and that we could eventually do things together in the future. So just as an instrument to get to know people who are also working in the field and want to know about our research.
Thank you.
So
That's
yes,
fantastic.
it's available.
Thank you.
And as a result, the data core database consisted of 3,050 survey items on perceptions, attitudes, experience of corruption, included in 321 national and cross-national survey rounds developed by 110 research projects of 83 different institutions around the world from 1976 to 2019. That was the final figures of the data set. And just for you to understand that the central idea of this exercise was based on the recodification of two original variables that were part of the data core database that we collected information: question concept and question dimension. And basically all the results, they kind of merge or try to interpret those the connections between those dimensions. The first one decodes questions in terms of conceptualizations of corruption, that is to say whether survey items denote or not specific behaviors or conducts practice that are somehow associated to corruption or perceived as corruption. And the second classifies questions in terms of the evaluation of the impact of corruption, whether self-reported or that is to say egocentric, or based on a society-wide perception of the incidence and prevalence of the problem, sociotropic. I have a map here. This is not part of this specific study, but it is part of the scoping review that I mentioned before. Just for you to understand and I think this is, it's easier to see this kind of information in a figure instead of explaining it by test. You can see, for example, the egocentric, self-reported personal experience, and generic, and example in the box, the top left box. For example, have you ever had to act in a corrupt way? And for example, an example of sociotropic generic, how widespread is corruption in your country? And the example of egocentric and the specific, have you ever been asked to pay a bribe? An example of sociotropic and the specific, how widespread is bribery in your country? Of course, not all questions that we cataloged, they were perfect in terms of match, in terms of each of the boxes. But we tried to map them and to put them as in terms of the closer they were of each box, because sometimes it's a bit tricky to identify in which box the question was part. So we had to establish rules, as I mentioned, to agree that this kind of question or item was part of that specific box. But that's it. The four possibilities are this combination between these two dimensions.
Gustavo, allow me to ask something that may already be in some of the participants' mind. Normally, when we read the discussion of a question or an indicator in terms of perception-based compared to experience-based, right? We understand perception-based as subjective opinions in terms of the level of corruption in general terms, and experience-based specifically related to victimization questions. But here you also include victimization questions as part of a categorization or classification of perception-based measurement of corruption. Could you walk us through a little bit of the rationale to get to that point?
I think in terms of, I understand what your point that there is a difference between experience, perceptions, but I do believe in this specific case, we are using perceptions only as a proxy for this large group of information that somehow dealt with experiences and practices, behaviors, and also, of course, perceptions of corruption. I do understand that there is this limitation in terms of identifying or separate those universes because they are not the same. But in this specific situation, I believe that we use it as a proxy for all those interrelated aspects that somehow can be not directly considered perception, but they somehow correlate. I think Luis has something to add.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that you can fit those questions in this categorization, and in fact, as you can see, egocentric specific would cover those items. The issue is we're not. I don't like very much the term victimization. Never liked it. There's self-reported conduct.
Mm-hmm.
And that self-reported conduct might be on an active or passive quality. Mm-hmm. Either you've been asked a bribe or you offered a bribe. Whether you are a victim, it's already a bias in the interpretation of the type of corruption you're dealing. So if it's kind of unleveled playing field that the passive agent imposes the terms of the deal, and you just have to accept, or you're not going to get the service or the decision, and it's almost like a abuse of power, extortion, concussion. Then you obviously, I think the term, okay, victimization could fit, but many of the exchanges, it's on a level playing field. It's not always in an uneven playing field. So, I mean, if we use Kenneth Galbraith's definition of power, that we're talking about a power relation between two individuals that are exchanging decisions for monies or favor or at a level playing field. But then you have the other two possibilities, and one of them is obviously the unleveled playing field, where people are constrained and they have no choice and they just have to pay for it. Nevertheless, we're talking about self-reported conduct. Mm-hmm. Or experience, self-reported. So we cannot say they're lying. We can never say when we ask a survey, people are answering to what we ask. I don't like. Often we have this discussion, especially when we're having the discussion with people who are not very familiar with survey instruments, that they have this feeling that somehow people are lying in these surveys and they're hiding. No, they're answering to what we give them, what we offer them as items. If you have constructed a bad question item, it's your fault. It's not the interpreters or the respondents' fault. So when we say people refuse, they seek refuge on political correctness in certain items, it's because the item has problems. So it's not the respondent's fault. But nevertheless, I think the categorization in a way covers the fact that we can look at the egocentric, at the self-reported personal experiences as one category of perception-based items, which can be, as Gustavo said, specific or generic, in the sense that in some cases we're very clear what we're asking, In other cases, it's a more
Abstract.
nuanced conduct. Yeah.
Does this mean that for the purposes of this research, then experiences of corruption, specifically bribery, for example, those questions would be used as a proxy for perceptions of corruption?
They are a kind of perception. Not, I mean, they're a kind of perception in the sense that you're trusting that an individual is telling you a story about his experience. You're trusting that somehow that the information that he's providing is based on facts that occur, but you were not there. I was not there.
I see what you mean. No,
we're seeing from the eyes of this individual, and sometimes you may interpret a situation as something that appears to be inappropriate conduct through the lenses of the individual in the actual exchange.
So then in that case, the wording needs to make explicit reference to illegal or unethical activities, correct?
The item?
Yes, because for example, in other surveys of experiences of corruption, when researchers try not to employ the word corruption or bribery for fear of them getting biased answers, I guess the opposite would apply here in the sense that for a person to perceive their behavior as corrupt, I mean, the item needs to specifically mention those terms, no?
If you're trying to use an item that tries to capture self-reported experiences of corruption, you can have both. I mean, you can have a more in fact, I think Gustavo on this.
I think it's not necessary that
you have corrupt way on the top corner for the egocentric generic, and you have specifically an illegal exchange bribe in the bottom left corner. But it depends. It depends on your research design. If you're looking at, you try to measure experience of specific, very specific exchanges. For instance, sex, the exchange of sex to have services. Then you should be explicit on the. Now, am I going to have a very low response rate for that particular item? You probably will, but you have to run the risk. But if you are looking for to measure that specific type of exchange, then you have to go specific, because otherwise you put a generic term and you can speculate that as part of that generic term, the concept of sextortion is also included, but maybe not. Maybe for some, maybe not for others. So,
But not necessarily you have to have the word corruption or the specific conduct mentioned. For example, you have questions, for example, mentioning about how much trust do you have in a specific organization in terms of fighting fraud or something like that. The main thing is to understand if when you read the question, and also the most difficult thing to when you read the question, you can understand if it is related to a macro behavior or something generic and tailored to the others and not focused on yourself, or whether it is something that you can ask directly. For example, do you have something, or no matter of the conduct, no matter the behavior that you're trying to capture. And then you have only to understand if this mention of the behavior of the conduct is something general in terms of trust, corruption, confidence and things like that, or for example, more specific in terms of bribery, embezzlement, or specific conducts of political conducts, like for example, misappropriation of funds or nepotism, that somehow connect to the idea of a general idea of corruption, but they are not corruption per se. That's it.
Okay. Kamel is raising his hand. Kamel, would you like to unmute yourself? And
Thank you. It's just a question about to what extent you will be sure about the answer of the respondent when you ask two questions for which the nuance is very, very small. How widespread is corruption in your country, and how widespread is bribery in your country? This means that the respondent should understand the difference and the nuance between corruption and bribery. So this may pose the question of reliability of the answers that you get, and of course the analysis that you will do from that answers. That's
Can I just quickly, Kamel, that's a very good point. As Gustavo was saying, to put the items into boxes, it's not always clear cut. I understand your point there. Still, the corruption is a broader concept in which you can fit series of conducts and actions that are not prescribed by law. And bribery is leading to a definition that's very attached to the illicitude of the act or the conduct. But as you said, the respondent might not be able to distinguish, make that distinguish that as academics do, and therefore we may run into the same type of trouble. We often in a survey you can try to use both and see how it differentiates, if it differentiates. But often when we go specific, we tend to use additional specific items for corrupt exchanges, so that we are already pointing the respondent towards a kind of differentiation between different types of conducts in the discharge of duties. In the case of the European Barometer, the Eurobarometer, the special Eurobarometer, you have a question on tolerance towards three types of exchanges: money, favors, and gifts. And that's pointing towards a more specific answer, and you get variation. You get variation. They're not understood as the same. But yes, I understand your point, and even among experts, I was once in a discussion about this, and there was someone from Bulgaria saying we don't have a definition of corruption. So it's like, how come? I mean, you need to have in your penal code, you know, the legal definition. Oh yes, it's called bribery. I mean, yeah, but it's there. It's the term is different, but we're talking about exactly the same exchange as in other countries. And even the legal act, the way it's coded in different penal codes, it's different. That's why we run these cross-national, we sign these cross-national conventions, etc., to harmonize our legal penal frameworks. I can give you in the context of Europe, in the French case, the crime of corruption is defined closely to the concept of traffic of influence. In the case of Portugal, the crime of corruption is coded as a crime against the public purse, whereas the crime of traffic of influence is coded as a crime against the realization of the state of law in different parts of the code. So even these small legal traditions show that there is different ways from a technical perspective, from a juridical perspective, of looking at the concept of corruption. Your point is very important, well taken. We're not looking at data. We're just coding survey items. So we were not looking if there were differences between these two items. We were just coding existing survey items. But it's a warn. You signal something that we need to be careful. When we choose for one or the other in a survey, I would suggest that if you choose for the second one, the more specific, that you should then add 2 other questions on other specific type of exchanges. Not just bribery, but maybe also exchange of favors and maybe also the offering or acceptance of gifts. So I think the strategy of the special Eurobarometer, in that sense, it's a good strategy.
And also my mistake, because the way I present it here, it kind of translates the idea that all these items were used at the same survey, and that was not the case. Those items came from different initiatives. So, for example, here, the sociotropic generic was found at the European barometer, the more specific one of the Africa barometer and the Latino barometer. So they came from different initiatives. They were not used together in the same survey. So basically to show that there are different ways to approach the same phenomenon, depending on, of course, where you present the information, considering the cultural environment and the understanding that people have about the issue of corruption. I'm not going to take longer about the methodological issues, but I just have to say that we also present the results in terms of time, grouped by decades, and also offering an interpretation that consider the divide between if it's a citizen or an elite survey, and of course also the governance at the governance level, if the survey was applied at the national or subnational level or across countries, and also the region where the surveys were conducted and their scope. And the results were framed in a bidimensional way, kind of a map that we are going to see in a few minutes. So in terms of results, we can see here from table 1 that we have an interesting trend in terms of, for example, in period of time that it was expected that we had more questions in recent times, because we had more initiatives dealing with this recently, and also more information available online. But we can see that we had changes in terms of the type of question that was implemented. Basically to show that, for example, you have a growing number of specific egocentric questions appearing in the data set. Also in terms of population, when we focus on citizen surveys, we can see that we had the opportunity to explore more nuanced specific egocentric and specific sociotropic ways of thinking about corruption. While when we consider elite surveys, the tendency is to focus on more generic and sociotropic identities related to corruption. At the governance level, it was something very interesting to notice that we expected, for example, to have more specific and egocentric initiatives, new ways to measure corruption in a subnational level, but we found quite the opposite, meaning that at the subnational level, surveys tended to be more generic and sociotropic. In terms of region, we can see a very interesting difference in terms of region. For example, when we look to Africa, there is space to focus on specific egocentric measurements of corruption, while, for example, in Asia, only 5% of the questions, near 5% of the questions dealt with the specific egocentric idealizations of corruption, and 79, almost 80% dealt with generic sociotropic perceptions of corruption in the Asian context. Also, we can see in terms of survey scope, we consider questions that were embedded in dedicated survey to deal with corruption, or embedded in a survey that measured somehow other political phenomena, and also measured, for example, quality of governments, policy outlook, measuring criminal judicial issues or social values and business climate. And we can find differences in terms of the balance of those questions in those different types of surveys that somehow presented corruption as a topic in their surveys. And for example, we can see that the dedicated surveys to measure corruption, 58% basically used generic sociotropic questions. While, for example, when we have the criminal judicial, the rule of law initiatives measuring corruption embedded in this kind of surveys, we had much more space to measure, for example, and to deal with a specific egocentric approaches of corruption. And now we can see the map. In terms of global average of all the 321 survey rounds cataloged, we can see that the global average is at the sociotropic generic box. And we have multiple initiatives that were put in different places, but the high amount of initiatives, they were concentrated in the generic sociotropic cluster. And we can see that this is the balance between generic sociotropic and specific egocentric items and questions in each survey round. Meaning that, for example, in terms of global average, surveys tended to be more sociotropic generic and less egocentric specific, for example. And this is something that we have to explore with more detail. In terms of time, we can see that we had few initiatives, but that we had this path in terms of going from 1976 to 2019. Until the beginning of the year 2000, we can see that we were going to the specific egocentric side of the spectrum, and then it stopped. And this is something that we have to better understand why this process of being specific egocentric, this process apparently didn't evolve. So in terms of conclusion, we can see that generic sociotropic questions, they are prevalent in the surveys. And as I mentioned, while attempts to specify individualized corruption have grown consistently until the 2000s and stopped. And also efforts to cover uncharted dimensions of corruption have been more common in cross-national and national than in subnational surveys, which was expected, but we have to better understand and contextualize why this happened. And also, I think this is a valid step in the future to insert more specific and egocentric questions in subnational surveys as to enhance our knowledge on more nuanced aspects of corruption that somehow can be measured in a more local and subnational perspective. And finally, that corruption perceptions in business surveys needs further investigation too, because those dimensions that relate corruption to specific and egocentric dimensions, they were not present or part in this kind of surveys that dealt somehow with perceptions of corruption. And that's the end of the part of the presentation. And thank you. I now give the voice to Luis to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. Joseph, how much time do we have? Because we've been exchanging views and delaying Gustavo from, but I think for the benefit of everybody.
Yes, I'm sorry. The conversation was so interesting that I let the clock run a little more than I should have.
Yeah, no worries.
Officially, we have 15 more minutes, but again, if you have the time availability and the rest of the participants would like to continue, I'm here as long as you need.
Okay, I'll try to make it as brief and compact as possible. As I said initially, this is related to the ethics project. We take also a neo-institutionalist approach to responses towards corruption. We want to see how institutions are interacting with citizens and producing effects in the way they perceive corruption by responding to the phenomenon and trying to mitigate certain standards. And obviously we're focusing on a very specific set of countries, EU democracies. That was the object of our study. And so formal institutions obviously are very central to democratic regimes. They establish, they set standards, and they try to enforce standards of conduct to office holders in the discharge of duties. And it's a fact that we also had a survey in this project looking at the perceptions of those holding office, of national MPs and local elected officials. We know that individuals make their choices on different subjects in different contexts, and they might decide that a certain conduct or act is not trespassing the line, so to speak. But they often do so by reference to patterns of behavior and by appropriating also rules and procedures that are set, embedded, handed out by institutions to individuals, both those holding office, but also citizens interacting with those holding offices. So in a way, we take the perspective that the institutions can constrain individual preferences, individual conducts, individual attitudes and understandings of what a given act or conduct may be or may not be judged as ethical or unethical. So that's the point of departure for this research. We're looking at how institutions set those standards, monitor how those standards are observed, and enforce those standards by sanctioning conducts that are not in line with the ethical template. So we started with a very general matryoshka puzzle. We're going through a period where we see this, and I say matryoshka puzzle because it's one crisis inside another crisis. We witnessed for the last 15 years democracy decline, with more and more countries having declined than improved in the Freedom House ratings, and democracy also is not delivering as expected or below expectations. So people want stronger public voice. They want stronger say in policy making, and then they're having the view that the opposite is taking place, and that also is giving room for populist uprise in recent years. And also adding to this, at the process level, we also have the resilience of corruption. Despite all the anti-corruption reforms, all the reforms on ethics regulation in politics that we have adopted and implemented in the past 2 decades, we've been performing pretty badly in terms of perceptions of corruption and ethics in political life. Obviously, some countries worse than others. And at the very center of this crisis, of this resilience of corruption in democracy, are political parties. Political parties are central to democracy, but they're also in the eye of the hurricane, so to speak, because they are perceived in many of the surveys that we looked at as the most corrupted institutions or the most corrupted democratic institutions. That's for 2/3 of European democracies. And they have consistently recorded low levels of trust. As you can see in the graph, that's trust in political parties at the EU level for the past 2 decades. And they pretty much scored below 20%, just slightly improved in the last few years, but that's systematically. And you know, for the centerpieces of democratic regimes, that obviously poses a series of challenges. If we look at comparatively, trust in political parties, in parliament, government, Gustavo, if you can, thank you, and satisfaction with democracy, you can see that looking at the other 2 institutions, 2 core institutions of our democratic regimes, you can see that definitely trust in parties is by far the most problematic. It's problematic if we take into consideration the EU 27 plus UK, but it's even more problematic if we exclude the democracies from the latest enlargements, and you can see that the problem is still there, even for more stable democracies. Obviously, not as badly, but it's still there. So we high levels of perceived corruption are associated with low levels of trust in political institutions. We have plenty of literature on this, by Miller, by Anderson, Verdova, many published articles on this. We also know that low levels of trust in political institutions impact negatively on general trust in the community, which in turn may erode political legitimacy, especially in young democracies. So I mean, is this crisis without a way out? Obviously, every crisis can also be a window of opportunity for institutions to innovate, to reconsider their importance towards fighting this general perceived decay of standards in political life. People Norris has written about this, that low levels of political trust offer this window of opportunity for political leaders to kind of develop new ways of addressing this resilient issue of corruption or unethical conduct. We have numerous examples of unsuccessful reformers and frustrated supporters of reformers within party organizations. We have a lot of initiatives taking place at the General Congress of Parties, and they are discussed, and they are voted, and they are put in the closet. So that generates obviously a lot of frustration, and political will is basically a mouthful of nothing if it does not translate into credible commitment. And you need that credible commitment towards regulatory reforms in order for these reforms to be backed by citizens. And that we were able to assess in that embedded experiment we had in both the citizen survey that we conducted under the scope of EPOCA project and the political elite survey to national MPs and local elected officials that we conducted in the ethics project. Because we repeated the same experiment, we were able to assess what was the middle ground for reforms between the insiders and the outsiders. How far are the insiders prepared to go without risking their interests, and how far do the outsiders perceive those intentions as credible? So that was, in a way, the purpose of this article that has just been published with party politics. So the party's venal nature is only a threat to its survival if voters believe, obviously, in the ideals of democracy, if they act according to those ideals, and if they perceive the party as being venal. And in some cases they don't, and a lot of cases they don't. So that poses a lot of challenges to reformists within party organizations. Obviously, citizens are not just voting, they are also quality controllers. They demand more better conduct from their leaders, their representatives. But still, we know how fluid these expectations can be, and we have a lot of studies on electoral punishment of corruption that clearly demonstrate that sometimes, that punishment is not there. Obviously, we have to take in consideration whether we are dealing with majoritarian electoral systems or proportional representation systems, because you might not be pleased with the conduct of a minister, but it's just one member in the list, and you can't punish the whole lot just because of the conduct of one of them. But there are obviously these nuances across different political systems, but overall the studies seem to indicate that that electoral punishment sometimes it's not there. So our conclusion in that embedded experiment was that the politicians support and voters reward ethics reforms inside party organizations, and we used a couple of standard reforms that we mapped from different initiatives that were taking place in different parties: financial disclosures, lobbying registers, sanctions for MPs that were involved in cases of corruption, like disqualification measures, etc. But if voters perceive self-regulation as something that has no credible political commitment in the backbone, they will not obviously favor it. They will think this is a charade, this is just cheap talk. So if that happens, then officials have fewer incentives to acquiesce. So it's kind of a vicious circle. Yeah, so basically, unless parties, basically that was the starting point, get their act together by clarifying standards to their members, to oversee how those standards are being observed and to enforce them when needed. For many years, we were studying political parties, the party organizations, and most of the literature was focused on the decision-making. Sometimes they were looking at the internal deliberative bodies, like the Congress and things like this. Very rarely, I looked into the literature. Were there publications addressing jurisdictional bodies within party organizations, conflict resolution bodies within party organizations? And they exist, and they act, and they are important. But often they are important in critical moments. So when things go wrong, you see these bodies emerging. Otherwise, yes, they are like the gray area of party organization that nobody knows a lot about and nobody's interested. But they are determinant sometimes to resolve a conflict between the list formation, internal elections in decentralized units. Even some address ethical issues regarding financing or the conduct of a representative in the public domain. But so this was kind of a blind spot in the literature, and that also was a reason to look into this. Gustavo, if you can, I need to make fast forward because otherwise we won't have time. So basically, we have the shaping of the ethical environment through regulation, both regulation imposed from above at the party system level, but also regulation that is taking place from within party organizations. Party ethics regulations, they're critical in framing these ethical climates in which parties operate at these two levels, and these two levels, they interact. For instance, you have a party financing law that requires parties to create financial officers or financial audit officers. That requires an internal statutes revision to create this new body. But sometimes you don't need to review your party constitution. You just need to change procedures, reporting procedures. But the two levels of regulation interact. We're not looking into this interaction. We're just looking at the efforts that party organizations have made in terms of setting standards to their members. So that we noticed that there's been a growth in party ethics self-regulation in the past few years through the adoption of codes of ethics or codes of conduct, through the creation of ethics committees, or through, as I said earlier, by enlarging the scope of already existing jurisdictional bodies. to cover certain aspects related to the ethical conduct of members, representatives, officials, etc. So how are they doing this? We basically take we use the lenses of regulatory theory. We looked at self-regulation as a normative process whereby political parties or political institutions in general, if we look at parliaments or governments, exert control over its own membership and their conduct. So we refer to this practice and commitment of party leaderships and the existing governing bodies within party organizations to voluntarily set ethical standards that are often enshrined in codes of conduct or specific passages in the party constitution or statutes or even other internal documents, but often in the past few years has been like codes of ethics or codes of conduct. So we have a norm setting dimension, we have an oversight dimension, and we have an enforcement dimension. And the oversight and enforcement, they kind of go together because we're talking about looking at the internal mechanisms, either committees or integrity officers or ombudsman persons that are responsible for overseeing those ethical standards that are enshrined in codes of conduct to see whether they're being applied and to resolve conflicts emerging from the application of these normatives. And obviously to address eventual breaches of those ethical standards. We have not looked at the practice. We're just coding the formal aspects of these growth in self-regulation. That was the initial purpose of this project. We really want to go and look into the practice by doing a more case study approach, more in-depth study of probably a couple of benchmarks that we have mapped and that we know that something is happening there in practice and we want to know what. And that obviously that requires time, the availability of parties to consider interviews. It's not easy. We tried in the case of Portugal, and we had 2 replies out of the all. So now we have 1, 2, 3, I think 7 parties in Parliament, if I'm not in error. Only 2 replied. One just suggested that we read a book by the founder of this party that talked about transparency in politics. And from there, we would learn everything they do about transparency. And the other just invited us for a very informal, nice chat. But it was very clear as we entered the room that this is not an interview. And you cannot use whatever we talk here in your study. So people who work with parties, they know it's not easy. It's not easy to get access to their databases on membership, etc. So you need to build that trust. And hopefully, I think in the Portuguese case, it's complicated because I'm a very visible person here. And as we're about to conclude this, I've been already sent a couple of messages that I need to go on the radio because they've just launched the CPI for this year. So I need to so because of that, visibility contaminates my work as an academic, and it's hard to approach Portuguese parties on these issues. But I'm confident I will be able to get some interviews in other cases, and we definitely go ahead with the more in-depth studies. In fact, a colleague of ours has already carried out this in-depth study for Swedish parties, 2 colleagues, and that article is published as part of a symposium in the Public Integrity Journal, in case you're interested. And there's also an article that kind of gives the general framework of analysis for party ethics or regulation. Okay, so can we just look at the images or the number of parties per country with the code of conduct? Of course, there are issues here. Let me just give you a quick glance at the database. The party ethics self-regulation database congregates data that was collected through profiling survey on ethics, self-regulation instruments and process within political parties. Initially, we started with 200 political parties with parliamentary representation in 2020. We were focusing mostly on EU democracies. We included a couple of known EU democracies. We included Albania, Canada, New Zealand, and Ukraine. So we have on total, initially we had 25 countries, but now the database has been expanded. We had we did a partnership with the ODIHR from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and they were very interested in this project. They've been working a lot on party ethics for many years, so they decided we would like to know a little bit more and that you could expand your database. And so we managed to expand to some additional democracies. So we have now 243 parties with parliamentary representation in 34 democracies, and we intend to expand also to other regions. We're looking now at the possibility. In fact, I'm applying for funding just now to expand this to Latin American democracies where the language problem is not an issue. But also we will look into some cases in Africa and obviously Asia. So that's something we're looking for partners, by the way.
Luis, if I could ask just one question, because I know that you have to run and you just mentioned bringing this graph to your discussion from the beginning of the presentation on this section. As we know that internal mechanism or the incentive for internal mechanism within parties is driven by its potential impact on their electoral performance. What do we know about the impact that already this code of conduct is having in terms of perception of corruption or building of trust and confidence in these parties?
As I said, that embedded experiment shows that as long as parties, well, it's still very exploratory. I wished we had more exercises of that nature in different countries. In fact, we want to repeat this as part of this large project we just won, funded by the European Commission, which is going to start now in 2024. It's called Respond. And we have a work package there. We're looking at cross-border types of political corruption. And we suggested repeating this or something similar to this conjoint experiment we embedded in both the citizen and the political elite surveys. What the results tell is that citizens, they're open to support these reforms, as long as they see that there is credible commitment behind them. So we need to find a common middle ground between, I understand that the incentives for leaders to engage in this is problematic, but you know, it can be rewarded. It can be rewarded. So you know, I understand that sometimes you feel that you're jumping into the unknown, and that the results, you start these reforms and you will just raise more noise, you will attract bad publicity instead of, you know, people saying, oh, they're doing something about this. I mean, I don't want to change the direction of the seminar to another subject, but I will tell you in another occasion the story about an experience I had with one of the largest football clubs in Portugal regarding disciplinary issues of executive members, which led to their expulsion. So we're talking about how organizations can impose those ethical standards to their members and make their internal bodies, jurisdictional bodies, work and eventually sanction. And what were the effects in public opinion regarding the club? It was not easy. We know that, you know, sometimes you're acting, instead of having the press that always complaining that that institutions are not responding to corruption, then they're so amused to see institutions responding to corruption that when they do respond and they're doing a good job, they don't. It's not news. It's not news. On the contrary, it might actually have the perverse effect. And so that's definitely not an incentive for reformers. But anyway, the study, which is still very exploratory, signaled that, and we already knew this from regulatory theory, that if you want to make a firm commitment, you really need to be backing your walk the talk, basically. You need to walk the talk.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for, I mean, that point that you just made about how actually when you're showing effectiveness in controlling things within your own organization, that actually exposes that dirty laundry to everybody, for everybody to see, and that may actually have the opposite effect of what you wanted, at least in the short term.
Yeah, and sometimes that's even a reason for not reporting. One of the reasons when we asked this question in the survey, you know, sometimes people do not report cases of corruption. In your opinion, what reasons would be? And we have this lot of reasons. In fact, we expanded that the possibilities of answering that question because we managed to collect from our focus group studies a couple of dimensions that were not in the literature. And one of them was the fear that if I report these, it's going to be out there, it's going to affect negatively the reputation of my company is going to lose contracts, and I'm going to lose my job. Therefore, you see how you know, it's a very long effect chain, but people reason like this sometimes, you know, they're like, no, let's just leave it because it's going to attract bad publicity, and let's pretend it didn't happen. So yeah, that's consequent. That's why I said, I mean, we take a neo-institutionalist approach. We want to see the interaction between institutions and people's behaviors and attitudes, etc. And I think that's what's fertile between these two projects, that combines a behaviorist and an institutionalist approach towards the very same problem. About the decay of ethics in political life and political corruption. So that's how we constructed our Party Ethics Self-Regulation Index with the three conceptual dimensions: norm setting, oversight, enforcement, or norm setting or standard setting, as you prefer, and 10 indicators that can be collected from the data we have in our profiling questionnaire. And so this is objective data, it's not perceptions. And so if we look at Gustavo, you can go ahead. exploring the political ethics self-regulation index, by regulatory dimensions. We have some differences here in terms of party families in our database. Obviously, we have an European bias in the database, so things might change as we expand the database to political parties in other regions of the world. But what the data shows that conservative parties, Christian Democrat parties, agrarian parties, they're more likely to develop ethics self-regulation instruments. It also shows that the conventional left parties, they tend to focus more on the norm-setting dimension, approving the code of conduct, and then not developing much the oversight and enforcement. And then we have the radical right and the ethnic parties, which are, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, they're increasing their vote in several democracies in Europe, but also at the European level in the European Parliament. And despite their claims for cleaner politics, they are actually the least likely to develop ethics regulation within their party organizations. So they're not walking the talk, you know. When we often say that their claims are a bit demagogic, etc., for the moment, in terms of ethics self-regulation efforts, we see that they're not at the forefront, by no means. That said, as we expand the database, maybe some of these initial findings might dissipate, and you end up with different alternatives to these. Finally, I think to conclude, Gustavo, if you, I already mentioned that we're working on 5 possible explanatory arguments for differences in political ethics self-regulation. One of them is self-regulation as a reactive response to scandal, to the exposure of integrity risks. But it can also be a strategic resistance towards regulation by law, in the sense that you move first because you want to avoid having this being imposed on you. It's strategic. So that's one of the possible arguments. The other is the self-regulation is an outcome of more institutionalized political systems that actually it's kind of I think it works. It shows that obviously more institutionalized party systems, they tend to have higher levels of regulations. It's normal. Institutionalization and the regulation of political life, they go hand in hand. Then another possible explanation is mimetic institutional isomorphism, that, you know, policy diffusion, if you want, that in a way you just look at what's happening around you and you copy paste. You know, if they're doing, I'm doing as well, because I don't know what the future will be, and therefore I just follow the trend and also policy diffusion within at the European level, within the same family of parties. The other possible explanation is party leaderships as looking at self-regulation as a complement to regulation by law. As I said, the interaction between both dimensions, that sometimes you need to say, okay, at the party system level, I don't control everything because I have to negotiate. I want to do more. I want to do more. I'm develop also my own response towards the risks of integrity risks or political corruption. I'll give an example of the Socialist Party a couple of years ago. We adopted a law, term limits to local elected officials. And when the law was about to be applied, there was a big argument about whether you would be able to run for office in a neighboring municipality. So cheating the law. And the discussion went on and then they decided to review the law to formally allow people that were facing a term limit to run for a different municipality on the ground that it's not the same, therefore he's a new guy there and he might lose. Obviously, we're talking about municipalities that just 20 kilometers away. So the possibility of not being known is very low. But nevertheless, that was the argument. The Socialist Party and the leader at the time, which was a very pro-ethics person, leader with a reformist mentality, always discussing about quality of democracy and the fact that quality of democracy has to begin within party organizations. If we don't set the example, then it's worthless. Adopting party system level regulation. He decided that no matter the new reading of the law, his candidates that were facing term limits will not be in the lists. Now, can you imagine the turmoil inside? And some of these veterans, some of these dinosaurs were like, you know, he's taking us out of the scene. And so they were, in fact, I could almost speculate that one of the reasons why it didn't last long as a leader was because it touched a very sensitive. He made a credible commitment. He said, I have people out there that are expecting more from us. I'm prepared to make this credible commitment, even if it runs against our internal interests, the internal interests of some of our members, and even if my head will be cut off after this. So he decided, he risked, and yes, he actually imposed. So that's one of the possible explanations. The other one is to look at self-regulation as an attempt to strengthen liberal democracy, as partly in response to the growth of illiberalism, of populism. And also because we see that the parties, ethnic parties and radical right parties are not very propense at adopting self-regulation. So self-regulation, to see this as a norm of mainstream party politics, supported by the conventional parties, even if only in a symbolic level, as a kind of face washing and kind of cleanup act. And in fact, we see some of conventional parties adopting codes of conduct, but very, very shallow codes of conduct. Just general principles, but any 12-year-old kid would do just fine, and then they would do something probably even more complex than that. So it's just sending out the message that they're not interested. They're just doing to give the impression that they're doing some, you know, the famous gatto pardo, il gatto pardo story. Everything has to change so that everything remains the same. That kind of attitude. So that's the explanations we're putting forth. Gustavo, I don't think there is an additional slide. I think, oh yes, there's the slide with the results, but that's what we've been talking about. So I think I would say that the seminar is concluded from my side, and I look forward to your comments, suggestions, and potential partnerships.
Thank you so much I mean, the two projects are, each one of them is interesting in their own right. And something that I kept thinking throughout the presentation was that in many aspects, some of the results are intuitive, but at the same time, it's so important to be able to test, putting numbers to those ideas, to those intuitions. For example, in the case of the distribution of different perception-based surveys, when I was looking at the results, when Gustavo was going through them, I'm thinking about how indeed specific and egocentric questions predominate in one area, and on the other hand, we have more general and sociotropic ones. And indeed, the description of the field of corruption metric or the topic of corruption metric within our field normally distinguishes the two kinds as being the most prevalent, but in a very intuitive or anecdotal way. And be able to actually see it numerically is quite impressive, and allows for us to think in terms of the reallocation of resources moving forward. And in the same way, in the presentation, in your presentation, Luis, or your discussion specifically about the self-regulation from the sense of political parties, indeed be able to think about these families of parties, and how their discourse is reflected in the way that they manage their own internal affairs. Thing that voters may be divided on, and to actually be able to test it and see the numbers about the results. I think that this is very important work, especially in the time that we're living right now.
Yeah.
When democracy feels that is on the line, and that we have to fight to protect it, being able to actually show to potential voters how these parties are behaving internally, and to what degree we can believe that they may provide us a solution to social problems or to the political corruption that many countries are experiencing. It is very significant. So thank you so much for this. Luis.
If I may, just to complete what you were just saying, I always I take the position that we shouldn't, as researchers in this field, we shouldn't put aside type of information just because we feel it's marginal, maybe there's not too much out there, and that, you know, we looked at the party databases, and then there was indeed a blind spot there. And indeed, there's not a lot of people interested in the conflict resolution, jurisdictional issues within party organizations, but that's important. It's not only in companies, it's not only in football clubs. Yeah, it's also important within parties. I mean, I've been linked to party politics before, and I can tell you there's a lot of conflicts in local, in decentralized party structures. When they run for elections, you know, sometimes the candidates are in dispute, and they have to appeal to a jurisdictional body to settle that conflict. So it's important. Obviously, there's a new dimension to this now, which is the ethical conduct of party representatives, party officials, etc. The series of scandals we've had in the past few years, but it's an important development. I think it's a recent development, but it cannot go unnoticed and cannot go untreated, and we need to stop it. Maybe it's just wishful thinking. Maybe it's just a cleanup act. It doesn't matter. We'll look into possible explanations, but we shouldn't just, you know, put it aside because oh, it's not as important as the decision making within party organizations. Yes, but it's also, as you said, in the current context, I think it makes sense. Also, just on the same ground, a couple of years ago, we conducted a study on cases of corruption in first instance courts. Only recently I published with a colleague a short account of that study, because that was from 2004, 2008 on the Portuguese case, and we said nobody's going to be interested. So, but let's talk about the methodology and produce a short piece on the methodology. And in fact, we looked at 838 cases. First thing, in order to look at 838 cases of corruption and related offenses, we had to strike a protocol, a formal protocol, with the Central Department for Penal Action and Investigation in Portugal. That's a small procedure, but it's important. Second, why am I looking at court cases when most of the literature, when they discuss cases, criminal cases of corruption, we always come with this iceberg theory. It's just the tip of the iceberg, because below the water surface, there's 2/3 or more, of this ice structure that is not exposed and covered, etc. So frankly, I'm not interested in court cases. Wrong. Court cases have juicy information about what the system is able to detect and eventually trial and eventually sanction. This is what Donatella Della Porta did in the 1992 publication Lo Scambio Occulto in Italy about the money pollution investigations. This is exactly the type of sociology of the crime. She made an anatomy of obviously the cases of corruption. We're not talking about legal institutional corruption, or we're talking about offenses in the discharge of duties. But there was juicy information out there that needed to be explored. So my recommendation to the group and to whoever will listen to the recording is that, don't snob data, just look into it, use it, explore it, and maybe you will learn something out of that, and something useful even for policymakers.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned the point about being able to, at the very least, even with outdated data or with past data, the possibility of contributing to the discussion of the methodology. That is a very important element of this Roundtable series. And as you probably noticed, a lot of the discussion was specifically about the methodology, because indeed, I mean, this is something that the corruption metrics need to continue developing. It's not just about continue collecting data using old techniques or old instruments, right? It's about seeing how we can further refine it to support the both research and reform activities. Gustavo.
No, I just want to add that from my perspective, what I think it's really important in terms of measuring corruption, specifically through perception, is related, for example, to what Luis just mentioned, that he is about to be interviewed in terms of what happened with the Portuguese data related to the CPI that was just released. And these kind of things that I believe that measuring corruption, not only measuring corruption, but assessing corruption through perceptions, it's useful to shape and to refine public policies. So it's not objective, but we can relate it to the real world through this channel, because we know that perceptions matter for framing policies, for developing initiatives that somehow tackle corruption. So sometimes the issue of measuring corruption appears to be a bit methodological and not directly related to this kind of things. But when we see that the better we measure and the better we assess the types of corruption that we are dealing nowadays, the better we frame and the better we develop policies. So I think this is pretty much connected, and we cannot develop better policies if we do not spend time developing better measures. So basically, that's it.
Thank you, Gustavo. Perfect way of finishing today's meeting. I couldn't have said it better myself. I was so lucky to have been able to get you both talking to us today. Thank you for being so extremely kind with your time. Thank you everyone else for staying with us throughout this conversation. And I hope to be able to see you and continue this conversation in some other venue, but very, very soon. Have a good day, good evening.
Thank you,
Stay in
Joseph.
touch.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you so